Snake bites kill tens of thousands of people around the world each year, but we're still using techniques invented in the late 19th century to make antivenom. And each bite needs to be treated with antivenom from that particular type of snake. Today, we're speaking with two scientists whose recent breakthroughs could save many more lives and help achieve the Holy Grail, a universal antivenom. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. Here with us today to introduce this story is Natasha Joseph, commissioning editor at The Conversation in Africa. Welcome to the show, Tash.
Hi, nice to be here.
So we're talking today about developing antivenoms for snake bites. Have you ever had a close encounter with a snake, Tash?
Well, I've got a couple, but the one that really stands out was when I was at university in the Eastern Cape province here in South Africa. I was hanging out with a couple of friends next to a dam. It was a beautiful summer's day, and my dog was with us. He was a small sort of terrier attempt at a dog, and he'd gone rootling off in the bushes, and suddenly my friend Ron, who these days is a very smart, very clever scientist, suddenly came flying across me like a rugby player and tackled this dog out of the way. He'd seen a cobra rear its head where the dog Toby was sniffing. And I'm glad he was paying attention, because Toby would have been a snake snack. And I realized afterwards that I had no idea what we would have done if he'd been bitten. It's not like you carry antivenom around with you. It seems a bit silly that I hadn't even thought about snakes as a risk for dogs. But Toby lived to sniff another day. Ron didn't pull any muscles, and we did not annoy the cobra anymore.
So that's a good end to your story. But a lot of people around the world aren't so lucky, and people are bitten by snakes all the time, aren't they?
Absolutely. The World Health Organization estimates that about 5.4 million people worldwide are bitten by snakes every year. And there are somewhere between 1.8 and 2.7 million cases where venom is actually injected into the person who's bitten. And those bites can result in anywhere between 81,000 and 137,000 deaths per year. Around 3 times as many amputations and other permanent disabilities are caused by snake bites annually. And unfortunately, the victims of these bites tend to be agricultural workers who obviously are out working in fields. Many of those are children. And of course, children are much more likely to die because of their smaller body mass. So it's really critical that we make progress towards developing more effective and available antivenoms.
Yeah, and that is happening. There are scientists out there doing that. And we're speaking to 2 of them in this episode who are really trying a new way of doing that, to synthesize antivenoms in their labs. And it's a big step forward, as we're going to hear, from the traditional way that this is done. The first scholar we've been speaking to is someone called Stuart Ainsworth. He's a senior lecturer in the Department of Infection Biology and Microbiomes at the University of Liverpool in the UK. And he explained to me that today's antivenoms are made in the same way that the first antivenoms were developed way back in the 1890s.
Antivenom is a very, very old medicine made in the 1800s, and it's made by taking a subtoxic quantity of venom and you inject that into a large animal. It's typically a horse, occasionally sheep, and it's a subtoxic quantity, so it doesn't kill or harm the animal, but the animal will start generating antibodies towards it, okay? And you keep injecting the animal over a very prolonged time, months, and they become hyper-immunized, essentially. So their blood is absolutely jam-packed full of antibodies against these toxins. The animal's then bled in a way that doesn't harm the animal. So you take some of the blood, you purify out the antibodies, and that is essentially what antivenom is. It's antibodies purified from a horse or a sheep. And it's still the way that it does today. You get a herd of animals, you immunize them, and the sera is then processed in a pharmaceutical manufacturing facility.
Are there any side effects?
There are huge side effects. Antivenom, because it consists of horse antibodies, usually, you're injecting a foreign protein directly into somebody's bloodstream. You're going to have adverse reactions, okay? So anaphylaxis is quite common. Also always quite common is a sickness called serum sickness, which tends to appear about a week or 2 later. It can be very uncomfortable, unpleasant. It's not really life-threatening, but you feel like you're on the road to recovery, and then you're feeling very, very unwell again. Because of the adverse reactions, some doctors are quite scared of using antivenoms. But if it's a life and death situation, you've got to weigh up the choice of giving antivenom, potentially dealing with those side effects, or not giving antivenom and seeing what happens.
Antibodies are very specific. And so antivenoms generated in this way mainly only work against the venoms that the horse or sheep has been injected with. A cobra antivenom isn't going to help you if you get bitten by a rattlesnake. The reason for this is that they actually include different toxins, and there are 3 basic types of snake venom.
We call them neurotoxic, hemotoxic, and cytotoxic.
Each has a different, terrifying effect on the person or animal that's been bitten.
So a neurotoxic venom, it targets your nervous system. Basically, it blocks the transmission of neurotransmitters. And once your muscles around your lungs become paralyzed, you can't breathe. So human snakebite victims tend to die of respiratory failure. And there's a very, very high case fatality rate with neurotoxic venoms because typically those venoms are quite rapid. And if you're bitten in a very rural area, you don't have the medical expertise on hand to perform intubations or get to a hospital. And snakes that have neurotoxic venom are typically things like mambas, cobras, kraits in Southeast Asia, taipans in Australasia, coral snakes across the Americas. Hemotoxic venoms are the venoms that actually kill probably the most people around the world. What these do is they interfere with how your blood behaves normally. Basically what the venom does is it consumes all your clotting factors in your blood. So your blood can no longer clot. Okay, so it's like hemophilia. If you get cut, you bleed. At the same time, and the venom's quite sneaky with this, is the venom causes you to bleed. So basically you've got blood that won't clot and you're starting to bleed everywhere. So eventually you'll die of massive internal bleeding or bleeding in the brain. Hemotoxic venoms that kill people, they're typically from viper snakes, so viperids. These are things like saw-scale vipers in Africa, Russell's vipers in India, few rattlesnakes in Americas. These venoms, even though they kill by far the most number of people across the world, it'll take, generally you speak, in a day, 2 days before the bleeding can become fatal. Hemotoxicity is a huge killer, especially in West Africa and again in India.
The third venom is called cytotoxic venom, and it destroys cellular material.
So it destroys your tissues, kills cells. Now, there are some snakes that have predominantly cytotoxic venom. So spitting cobras are notorious for their cytotoxic venoms. Some of the bothrops, the lanceheads from South America as well. Basically, if you're bitten by these types of snakes, if you survive, you'll end up probably losing a digit or a limb even, or having to have extensive skin grafts afterwards.
Given that these different venoms affect the body so differently, it makes sense that there's not yet a universal antivenom for snake bites. But scientists like Stuart are hoping that their research will succeed in creating one.
Universal antivenom is considered the holy grail. For example, if you're in Kenya, there's 26 different medically important venomous snakes. People who get bitten and people who treat people that get bitten are not snake experts. If somebody gets bitten by a snake, they're not going to go, oh, that was an Eastern green mamba, or was it a Jameson's mamba? They're going to say it was a big snake.
Scientists have been trying to make more universal antivenoms. They've used the traditional method of injecting livestock with venoms from multiple types of snake to make what's called a polyvalent antivenom. The hope is that this would neutralise different types of venom, for example, both neurotoxic and hemotoxic, at the same time. But these polyvalent antivenoms produced using the age-old horse technique generally tend to be weaker. That's because they've got a bigger mix of antibodies in them and so are more diluted. They're also more expensive to produce, although even a single antivenom for a specific snake is already really pricey to make. The market for antivenoms is often very localised around a particular place where a snake lives, and that's often in some of the poorest places in the world in Africa and South America.
Big pharmaceutical companies tend to have taken a step back, especially throughout the latter half of the 20th century, from producing these because it just doesn't make economic sense for them. So most antivenoms now are produced by public manufacturers within countries. Unfortunately, in sub-Saharan Africa, there's only 2 manufacturers on the continent, one in South Africa, one in Egypt, and the rest of the continent rely on manufacturers in Mexico, in Wales, in the United Kingdom, and in India, basically, to import antivenoms in.
Developments in modern biotechnology are now opening up new avenues to grow antibodies in laboratories, and scientists like Stuart are trying to use them to make antivenom.
In the latter half of the 20th century, and more definitely accelerated in the 21st century, you've got the development of monoclonal antibodies. So these are antibodies that are grown in a laboratory. It's a single antibody that you know very well what it does. It's super potent. You can humanize them as well, so they can make them look like human antibodies. So you can basically trick the immune system into thinking, oh, this antibody is actually one of us, so you don't get the adverse reactions or a lot fewer adverse reactions.
In the 2010s, monoclonal antibody therapies were mostly used experimentally in the treatment of cancer. And then in 2020, COVID happened.
The pandemic was actually quite useful in a way because it kind of supercharged this notion that monoclonals could be used for infectious diseases. Because there was so much money pumped into COVID, a lot of research went into how can we make these antibodies at large scale for as fast and as cheap as possible. So there's been some quite big technological advances since the pandemic on that.
There are a couple of ways to grow the antibodies that make up antivenom in a lab. The first is to take antibodies from an immunised animal, like a horse that's been bitten by a particular snake. Isolate those antibodies, sequence the cells that make them up, and then grow lots of that antibody in a bioreactor. Another way, which Stuart has used in his own research, is to go hunting through huge libraries of human antibody sequences.
So you're hoping that in that enormous number of antibody sequences, there's going to be one in there that does the job really, really well. So you have to basically search through. And then you get the sequence, you put it into your cells, you put them in the bioreactor, and they just spew out loads of antibodies, basically.
Stuart and his colleagues at Liverpool used this technique to look for antibodies that could neutralise a particular type of neurotoxin found in the venom of snakes, including mambas and cobras. And they found one.
So we found an antibody that's able to neutralise one toxin family that's present in a lot of snakes. What's notable about this study is the breadth of neutralisation that we were able to achieve. Lots of different species from lots of different corners of the world were able to neutralise this toxin in their venom.
This discovery could be one step in the long process to develop a universal antivenom that could neutralise other types of toxin, not just neurotoxins, but cytotoxins and hemotoxins too.
So for a universal antivenom, what you're going to need is basically a cocktail of multiple different monoclonal antibodies that can all do basically the same thing within their class, i.e. recognise lots of toxins and neutralise lots of them.
This cocktail of lab-grown antibodies would then be able to target the venoms of lots of different snakes, and so a doctor could give it to a patient without needing to know which snake they'd been bitten by. This is an exciting time to be working in antivenom research, but Stuart says a universal antivenom is still a way off.
Personally, I think probably 10, 20 years away.
Before we continue, I want to tell you about a new podcast tied to the upcoming Paris Olympics from our colleagues at The Conversation in France, in partnership with Slate. It's in French and it's called La Science Moule le Maillot, which roughly translates as Science Gets Sweaty, or How Science Can Help Us in Our Everyday Lives. The show looks at how scientists can help athletes to win medals and help all of us perform a bit better at the sports that we love. My colleague Benoît Tonson will be joined each week by another journalist from The Conversation to explore the science behind a different sport, from swimming to cycling. And in the first episode, which is out now, he talks to Michael Campo, who's the mental preparation coach for the French men's rugby team. So if you want to practice some French and learn about the science of sporting success in the process, go search for La Science Moule le Maillot wherever you listen to your podcasts. So obviously Stuart is talking here about all this progress that's been made over the last few years. But Tash, did you know that antivenom was mostly made by injecting snake venom into a horse? That really astonished me when I heard it.
I mean, I'm especially astonished if it was always the same horse. I feel like I vaguely did know that, Gemma, and that it's kind of been done that way for a long time.
It really feels like it needs a bit of an upgrade. And Stuart Ainsworth is one of these many snake venom researchers out there who are trying to find antibodies, synthesize them, and then see if they'll work out as antivenom. But you've been working with another researcher who's also doing this. Tell us about Christoffer.
Christoffer Vinther Sørensen is a postdoctoral researcher in the Centre for Antibody Technologies at the Technical University of Denmark. And I worked with him about a story he and his team wrote for The Conversation about their quest to develop a new antivenom for Bothrops asper, which is a pit viper that's responsible for most of the harmful and fatal snake bites in Central and South America.
And what drew you to this research in particular?
Well, the fact that actually it failed. I find it really interesting that there's this sense out the world that science is always right and that it's right the first time. And I think people don't realize that scientists are often getting things wrong. And even though that can be a tough day in the lab, they also realize that by getting things wrong, you can move further along in the process. And I think that's really what good science should be, admitting, okay, we did this wrong, not keeping that information to ourselves, sharing it with the wider kind of anti-venom research world, because ultimately what they want is to have effective anti-venom.
We've discovered this new trapdoor you can fall through right before the end goal.
Before we get into what went wrong for Christoffer and his team, it helps to understand a bit about what they were trying to do. So you've been looking at a particular type of viper, a venomous pit viper called the Bothus asper. Tell me about this viper.
Well, it lives in the northern part of South America and Central American regions. It's a rather large pit viper. It can get to around 6 kilos and 2.5 meters in length. So it's quite a hefty snake. And in the areas it lives, it's notorious for being responsible for the majority of snake bites and snakebite related deaths and amputations and all of that nasty stuff. These snakes, like many snakes, change throughout their lifespan as they grow bigger. They need bigger food. But yeah, overall, they eat anything within their range. So that can be rodent, and the small ones eat insects as well. So they are anything they can get their fangs on.
There is currently an antivenom available for this pit viper's bite, but it requires milking the snake. So, like Stuart Ainsworth, Christoffer and his team in Denmark were trying to develop a more effective monoclonal antibody antivenom. Christoffer's work involved sifting through those libraries of billions of human antibodies in a process that he says is a little like fishing.
We've taken the exact components from this snake venom that we want to neutralize, and then we've put them on a molecular fishing rod, and then we've went fishing in the human immune system and pulled out some of the best things we can find in the human immune system for targeting this exact snake venom. And then from here on, we take these antibodies and then we clone them into some large cell cultures that can then be produced in cell tanks, like how you produce most modern medicines. And this way we don't have to go through a horse, we don't have to keep milking the snake, we only need to milk it a bit for discovery, and then after that we can just ask the cell culture to produce more antivenom.
Once they find a combination of antibodies that will bind to the toxin, they have to test whether it will neutralize it too. This is a long, multi-step process.
So first, when we have discovered some antibody candidates, then we need to figure out how well they actually bind to this toxin that they're supposed to neutralize. And we do this by testing them in something called immunoassays.
Then when they found a functional antibody that can both bind to and then neutralize the toxin, they test it on lab-grown muscle tissue.
Then we test what happens if we just add the toxin. Then we test what happens if we add the toxin where our antibody is also involved. And then hopefully we see that we have less muscle damage or cell damage when we have our antibody involved.
The final step is to take the most promising candidates and test them on live mice. They usually do this by mixing together a bit of the snake venom and a bit of the antivenom candidate for about 30 minutes.
And then you inject the cocktail into the muscle tissue in the mouse. And then we basically wait 3 hours and then measure how much muscle damage has occurred.
So you went through all this long process, these different steps, so you had these good candidates. Then it failed. What happened and how did you know it wasn't working?
Yeah, it failed quite substantially, you could say. It was an impressive failure because it had been through years of testing, it had been neutralizing consistently this snake venom we wanted to neutralize. But then when we tried to go into a different experimental setup, it all of a sudden started having the opposite effect.
This happened when they decided to simulate how a snake bite works in real life. So instead of mixing together a cocktail of the antivenom and the venom, they injected a bit of the venom first into the mouse and then injected the antivenom a bit later.
We knew it failed when it started making the venom more potent instead of neutralizing it.
So that must have been very disappointing.
At first, it was extremely disappointing. Actually, so disappointing that we didn't believe the results. So when we spoke to our collaborators over in Costa Rica, all four of us, we agreed that something must have happened. Like, these results make so little sense that we should probably just repeat it because something must have gone off date. So we made completely new antibodies and worked for half a year to get this set up again. Then we repeated the assay, with exactly the same results. Like you could almost draw a direct line between the measurements, which was incredibly disappointing, especially because I got some of these data very soon to handing in my PhD. Actually, some of them meant I had to rewrite my PhD in 48 hours.
So you've essentially discovered that rather than kind of neutralizing a venom toxin, that this antibody enhanced it.
Yeah. What we've discovered is what we have termed antibody-dependent enhancement of toxicity, which means that it was not the antibody that caused the harm. When we just injected the antibody into the animal, then it was completely fine. It was only when the venom and the antivenom was present that it had an increased damage. And it's the first time it's been seen with toxin from an animal kingdom. About 40 years ago, it was seen from a mushroom toxin, and it's also been seen from a bacteria, but it's never been observed in a snake toxin or any animal toxin. So it was not a known risk. And by publishing this failure, we hope that we can ensure that other people can test for this before, so that there's less time wasted. Because this is something we discovered like 4 years into the project. So if we could ensure that other researchers maybe only waste 1 year on their molecules that will fail in the end, then in the end we should get a better antivenom faster in the future.
The antivenom research community is a pretty small world, and it turns out that Stuart knew Christoffer's team and had read their paper.
I think it's really, really helpful. I mean, the paper was absolutely fascinating, and I think this sort of increased potency of toxins from antibodies, so it's been observed in that study. It appears to be quite a common phenomenon. It's just negative results aren't published that often. And, they should be published, because by publishing those results, it will help other scientists. Either it'll prevent them from making the same mistake, it'll help them understand why things are happening that way, and we can basically develop strategies to stop it from happening in the future. Science is supposed to be for the community, essentially, is for everybody. So publishing the negative results is not about one-upmanship, basically. You don't want to stop your collaborator or your competitors doing something. Within snakebite envenoming, we're all towards this goal of reducing mortality and morbidity.
Well, and maybe that's a lesson to future scientists in the future, that it is good to talk about your negatives and not just your positives. Christoffer says that they still haven't definitively figured out exactly why the toxicity of the venom was enhanced by their antivenom. But they do have an idea how the enhanced toxin acted inside the mice. In that previous study of a mushroom toxin doing a similar thing, the scientists had noticed that instead of attacking the liver, its normal target, the mushroom toxin affected the kidneys.
It meant it was more fatal. So, with inspiration from this study, we sampled some of the tissues in the mice that we had been testing on. So we sampled tissues from the lung, the heart, the liver, and the kidneys. And then we looked, where do we see increased damage? And normally this venom is mainly acting on muscle tissue. So it's not really supposed to act on the kidneys. So while we can't really conclude it, we can say that there was at least more damage in the kidneys, and we find that very strange. This can happen due to increased muscle damage, but it can also happen if the antibodies are somehow carrying the toxins away from the tissue they're supposed to work in, and instead to the kidneys, where they might be able to work as well. We are applying for money to kind of figure out what is going on here.
Well, thank you so much, Christoffer. I really appreciate you talking to us about this research and your failure. And again, well done for publicising it, because it's decisions like that that really push science forward. So well done.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for this week's episode. Thanks to Natasha Joseph at The Conversation in Africa, who you heard on today's show. And thanks to both Stuart Ainsworth and Christoffer Sørensen. We'll pop links to articles by the two of them and their research teams about their work in our show notes. This episode was written and produced by Katie Flood, with assistance from Mend Marawani. I'm Gemma Ware, the show's executive producer. Sound design was by Eloise Stevens, and our theme music is by Nita Saul. Stephen Khan is our global executive editor, and Soraya Nandi does our transcripts. You can connect with us on Instagram at theconversation.com, or email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. Do also sign up with The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. If you like what we do, please support our podcast and The Conversation more broadly by going to donate.theconversation.com. And please rate and review the show wherever you listen. It really helps us reach a wider audience. Thanks very much for listening.